ChatGPT Plus is free for college students through May. Here's the thing. You've got a lot to do between now and then. Studying for finals, writing papers, trying to keep your life on track, and ChatGPT can help with all of it. It can quiz you for your econ exam, make a study guide from your French notes, plan out your meals and study breaks. It can get really specific on how you like to learn. It can even help you come up with ways to stop procrastinating. So from now until summer break, take advantage of all the ways ChatGPT can make your life easier. Restrictions apply.
We off?
30 seconds of carefree bliss.
Oof, like wind in your hair carefree.
Oh, like using Clorox Disinfecting All-Purpose Cleaner in the home carefree.
Yes!
Like dog slobbing on the coffee table and cleaning it with Clorox Carefree.
He's on a roll now.
Spit toothpaste on the faucet.
You got it. You got it.
Peanut butter on the light switch.
Oh, spritz, spritz.
Spritz, spritz. Clorox, man. Clean feels good.
Okay, we're back.
Use as directed.
Oh my God, it's the coolest thing ever. Hey guys, have you heard of Goldbelly? Well, check this out. It's this amazing site where they ship the most iconic, famous foods from restaurants across the country, anywhere nationwide. I've never found a more perfect gift than food. They ship Chicago deep dish pizza, New York bagels, Maine lobster rolls, and even Ina Garten's famous cakes. Seriously. So if you're looking for a gift for the food lover in your life, head to goldbelly.com and get 20% off your first order with promo code GIFT.
Hello and welcome to Backlisted, the podcast which gives new life to old books. Today, you find us on Marylebone High Street in London, sometime in the mid-1960s. A tall, somewhat worried-looking woman emerges from Unwin's, clutching a large bottle wrapped in tissue paper. She stares idly into shop windows as she passes, her steps quickening as the evening darkens. I'm John Mitchinson, the publisher of Unbound, where people crowdfund the books they really want to read.
And I'm Andy Miller, the author of The Year of Reading Dangerously. And today we are joined by two returning guests. Welcome back, Linda Grant and Lucy Scholes.
Thank you for having us.
Linda, say hello.
Oh, hi.
It's like you're watching telly, Linda. What?
Yeah, it sort of is.
I know, right? Anyway, welcome back. Now, Linda Grant first joined us on Backlisted on our second ever episode, which was about Jean Rhys's Good Morning Midnight. And so we owe you a huge debt of thanks, Linda, for starting this enterprise so stylishly. That's still one of the most popular episodes of Backlisted, which is wonderful for us and wonderful for dear Miss Rhys. And we can only apologise profusely that it's taken 8 years for us to bring you back. So thank you so much for being here. Linda is the author of 9 novels and 4 works of non-fiction. She's won the Orange Prize for Fiction, the South Bank Show Award, the Wingate Prize, and been shortlisted for the Booker Prize for Fiction and this year's George Orwell Prize. Her latest novel, The Story of the Forest, was published in May and moved Nigella Lawson to write, "I'm in awe, I'm charmed, and I want to press a copy on everyone I know." Linda, were you expecting Nigella to say that, or was that a delightful surprise?
She's a good woman, let's put it that way. I'm very grateful to her. She asked for a signed copy as well.
That's amazing.
Ooh,
after she'd read it.
Oh, well, listen, thank you so much for coming back. We're so pleased to have you
It's a pleasure.
back. And also, we're also delighted to welcome back for what is apparently her 5th appearance on Backlisted, friend of the show, Lucy Scholes. Hello, Lucy.
Hi, it's very nice to be back again.
Lovely to
She
have you.
previously joined us on episodes dedicated to Barbara Cummings, Anita Bruckner. Let's say it again. You were on the Anita Bruckner episode, the legendary Bruckner episode.
I mean, that's my claim to fame for above all else in my life. I made it onto the Backlist Bruckner episode.
On the Bruckner episode, I know. Penelope Fitzgerald and Penelope Mortimer, all the Penelopes. And what we like to think of as the core Backlisted backlist. She is senior editor at McNally Editions, a series of paperbacks devoted to hidden gems, including the Penelope Mortimer title you talked about on this, right?
Yes, and I owe you both a debt of gratitude because I hadn't read that book for quite a while. And then I just started working for McNally when I came on the show to do the Mortimer episode. And it was rereading it, listening to you guys talk about it, enjoying it again. I thought this needs to be back in print. So yeah, we brought it back in America, which is great.
Is that the first time it had actually been published in America?
No, it was originally published with the title Cave of Ice, very different to Daddy's Gone Hunting.
As opposed to Daddy's Gone A-Hunting, which
Yes.
was the original UK title, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we brought it back with Daddy's Gone A-Hunting, but it was the first time it had been reprinted.
Wow.
Yeah, so thank you very much, both of you, all of you.
Our pleasure. Lucy hosts Our Shelves, a podcast from the legendary feminist publishing house Virago, and wrote Recovered, a column for the Paris Review about out-of-print and forgotten books that shouldn't be. And one thing we should say about today's choice of book is it has never been out of print since it first appeared in 1965. John, what is the book we are discussing today?
The book we're discussing is The Millstone, which is the third novel by Margaret Drabble. As you say, first published by Weidenfeld and Nicholson in 1965 and as a Penguin paperback in 1968, adapted for the screen by Waris Hussein in 1969 with the screenplay by Margaret Drabble as A Touch of Love, starring Sandy Dennis and a young Ian McKellen. We'll be talking about that later. So the story of the novel is a first-person narrative of that of Rosamund Stacey, Cambridge graduate in her mid-20s, who is writing a thesis on Elizabethan poetry and living rent-free in her parents' large Marylebone flat. She's in half-hearted relationships with two very different men, novelist Joe Hurt and accountant Roger Anderson. She becomes pregnant by a third, George Matthews, an apparently gay BBC radio announcer, after a rather awkward one-night stand. But she decides to have the baby, breaks it off with her two boyfriends, and forges her own path forwards. At the heart of the novel is an exploration of Rosamund's complex emotional reaction to pregnancy, childbirth, and the postnatal illness of her child. Drabble said herself the novel aimed to show how maternity changes you into something fiercer than you were before. Often hailed as a feminist classic, the writer Tessa Hadley goes further, claiming on the 50th anniversary of its publication that The Millstone was the seminal 1960s feminist novel that Doris Lessing's Golden Notebook is always supposed to be. Anyway, in its sensitive and original treatment of status anxiety, sexual mores, attitudes to raising children, and what we now call work-life balance, The Millstone certainly feels both absolutely of its time, but also oddly prophetic.
Also, before we get on to the main discussion, I'm going to throw a question out to the panel. The Millstone is a historic novel. The publication of Millstone by Margaret Drabble is a historic novel for a specific technical reason. Do any of you know what it is?
No.
Do you speak for everyone, Linda?
I think it would be fair to say. Well, you mean the history of like printing or technical?
Yes. And that's my clue. In the history of printing, The Millstone by Margaret Drabble is a historic publication. What is it?
Is it to do with it being in paperback?
No, good guess, but that's not correct.
Right, okay.
Some kind of new lithographic printing process that had never been tried.
You're getting close.
I didn't know I was supposed to come on here with a history of printing as well at my fingertips.
Well, you've been on before, Lucy. You've been on before.
Go on, Andy. Put us out of our misery.
It's the first novel in the history of British publishing to be set on a computer.
In 1965.
Well.
Yep, in 1965. And I discovered that fact when I was searching the Times archive. And there's a Times story from 1965 which says, in the future, it is believed there will be such a thing as an electronic book. And within that story, it says already a new novel published by Weidenfeld, Margaret Drabble's The Millstone, is the first novel ever to have been set on a computer.
Amazing.
There you go.
And you're surprised that none of us got that.
Yeah.
That is surprising, given that it was mid-60s. But it's obviously George Weidenfeld was always a man at the cutting edge of innovation in publishing.
Quite so, quite so. So let's kick off our discussion in the usual place. Linda, when did you first encounter The Millstone? When did you first read this novel?
I would have encountered it as soon as it came out in paperback. You said it came out in paperback in 68, did you say?
Yeah.
In that
Yeah,
case, I was 17. I wouldn't have read it in hardback. I would have read it in paperback. I couldn't afford hardbacks. I was a schoolgirl at the time, schoolgirl in Liverpool. And it was the book that everybody was talking about and everybody was reading. It was being sold in a way as a story of the sexual revolution and being a very racy book and being quite shocking. The thing about Rosamund is that in the entire sequence of the novel, she only has sex once. She's a virgin. She has sex once, gets pregnant, and doesn't see the guy again for several years. And she doesn't have sex before or afterwards. So it's not really so much a book about sex. But it was very shocking that an educated, intelligent woman chooses to have a baby on her own. She doesn't choose to keep it because abortion was illegal. She chooses not to have it adopted. But for me, reading it in provincial Liverpool, there we are in the West End of London, Marylebone High Street, an apartment in which a woman has gone out to buy a bottle of gin so she could try the old bottle of gin in the bathtub routine, try and have an abortion that way. So what happens is there's a knock on her door and a bunch of her friends, who all seem to be novelists and poets, arrive and ask her if she wants to go and see the new Fellini film. She says no. They hang around, they drink the gin, and by the time she goes to pour the bath, the water's cold. And to me, as a 17-year-old, it was like, this is miraculous. This is the world I want to live in. I want to be with these people. I want to know people who are writing their first novel, been published as novelists. It was absolutely incredible. So that was the sort of the opening thrust of it for me, reading it at that time.
Lucy, well, now when did you first read Margaret Drabble?
I'm rather embarrassed to say I came to her quite late. I think the first Margaret Drabble novel I ever read was one of her much more recent books, The Dark Flood Rises, I think, which was published in 2016. And I reviewed at the time.
Is that her most recent novel? It is, isn't it?
I think it might be, yes.
It is.
And I liked it. Yeah, that's right, Canongate. I liked it, but I didn't love it. Let's put it that way. And it's about people of her age. It's about older people, coming towards the end of their life. And I think maybe it sort of didn't ring too many bells with me. And then, really randomly, because this is such an odd book for her to have recommended, but it was actually the novelist Nell Zink who first recommended Margaret Drabble to me. And I was trying to find the email that I thought she'd written me about it, and I couldn't find it today. So I think it might have been in person. We were chatting about it, and she had read The Waterfall, one of the early novels, and said it was really wonderful and I should look at it. And I hadn't looked, and I sort of knew of the Millstone. I knew there was something there that I probably should read at some point. So I picked up The Waterfall, read it, loved it, and in that way that I tend to do, because I do like to sort of binge authors and binge books, I then just started at the beginning and I read through all her early novels. I think this was in sort of summer 2019. And ended up writing about the Ice Age for my Paris Review column, because at that point that it was actually out of print in America, and there were a kind of collection of them. Obviously, the Millstone wasn't, but I was really surprised at these absolutely brilliant novels. I mean, they're very of their period in so many ways, but also they're not. They totally spoke to me as a, still, and I couldn't believe that people weren't talking about them and sort of reading them, and there weren't these editions that were always available.
Well, we should say two things. First of all, happily, Margaret Drabble is still with us in her early 80s. And also, she was very famous for a while in the 1960s and 1970s. And we have a clip here of the beginning of a film that was made in collaboration with her by the film director Richard Marquand from 1968, who made this in 1968 and 15 years later directed Return of the Jedi. There's another tiny fact for you.
And you can see where it all began in this film.
Yeah, but when you hear this clip, you'll see if only Ewoks ran onto the set at this point. Anyway, this is how they kick off this documentary about the young writer Margaret Drabble. She is being interviewed, and this will place, Linda, I would like you to comment on this once we hear it, about what it meant to be a young female novelist in the late 1960s.
Margaret Drabble is a novelist. She's also married and the mother of 3 children. None of this is particularly extraordinary, but Margaret Drabble is 28. She's written 4 novels and a book about Wordsworth, and is now completing her 5th novel. Isn't it hard, in fact, for you to live a life like that? I imagine most married women make a choice between a career of some sort and their home. Why have you done both? Why are you both the mother of 3 children, a wife, and a very busy professional novelist?
I don't know, because in a sense, I can't do without any of them. I didn't think when I was younger that I would want to have children, but having had one, I knew that I wanted them very much, and this was a very important and sort of unavoidable experience, significant in a way that nothing else had been. And yet I couldn't, because I'd got children, spend my life wheeling pushchairs around the park. I had to do something else as well. So in a sense, I've always felt that there was no choice for me, that I simply had to do both. And I've never decided between them. My life is a continual and absolutely exhausting compromise. I'm always rushing from one to the other and never knowing where I ought to be and feeling totally guilty about every part of my life. And yet there's none of it that you can't give up children. They exist. You can't possibly say, I'm not going to be a mother to these children. And so really it's a question of me worrying about what hours I spend doing what.
In other words, you try and do both exceedingly well.
I try and do everything well, and I'm always failing. There's nothing I dislike more than failing for sort of silly practical reasons like being unpunctual because a child was crying, or leaving a child crying because I've got to get to a place on time. And this kind of thing is always happening to me. I feel terrible about it, but there's nothing I can do about it. I ought to be able to give up, I suppose, my professional life, but I can't do it, and I know I'm not going to.
I mean, goodness me, right? That speaks to the dilemma at the heart of the Millstone, but also reminds us what a challenge it was to, in theory, have it all. You can't possibly do both, right?
I'm struck by the fact that she got married, I think, not long after leaving university, and she had 3 children before she was 30, I think. So she had a very conventional trajectory, which she was always in the process of trying to undermine. And I think there's a tremendous level of self-awareness and determination there that you see in her characters as well. And she says, I can't give it up. I know myself too well. But it's obvious that, it's laughable to think that anybody would have those expectations of a female novelist today. But I wonder in the past how many young women writers there were who had 3 children. So I think it was an incredible achievement on her part to have risen so fast, so far in a few years. I mean, it's an incredibly intense period of time in which she accomplished an enormous amount.
4 novels and a book on Wordsworth, and 3 children by the age of 28. I mean, as he says at the beginning, not terribly remarkable. You say, it's unbelievably remarkable, you fool. You try it.
Yeah. Lucy, how did you, when you started reading Margaret Drabble then, like as you were talking about, did you appreciate her achievement as a young writer?
Oh, yes, I think very much.
As much as a young woman in that era?
I think so, because the more I found out about, even I sort of, obviously I knew a little bit about her, but the more I looked into it and realised that she was writing these novels when she was incredibly young. And I think that wonderful, weird documentary, I remember watching that, I think, around about that time when I was discovering her work and being struck by the fact that she was clearly this incredibly intelligent woman who obviously, like she said, unapologetically, she can't give up working, but she also wants to have children, and why shouldn't she, and why can't she make it work? And I think the early novels in particular are all very, I don't necessarily want to say autobiographical, but she clearly drew on her own life and her own experiences.
But they are, right? I mean, this is one of the things I wanted to ask all of you. Is she an autobiographical writer or not?
I think she's writing about the experiences of educated women. And educated sounds a bit snobbish, but it was by no means obvious that intelligent young women would go to university in the 50s or 60s.
Right.
So she's educated, she's hyper intelligent, she has this incredible powers of concentration, I think. She's erudite. And she came and talked to my university English department when it must have been in the early 70s. And she was incredibly glamorous and beautiful as well. I think she had started out in acting at
Yeah, she's
university and then
RSC.
gravitated into writing. So she sort of had it all, really. That's a horrible expression, but she was very, very famous in the 60s and 70s, and she stayed with me. I've traveled along the whole of my life up to that last book. She's about 10 years older than me. That last book, which is writing about a number of people who've reached the terminus old age, I think that is her last and final book. So she's always been there exploring the next big thing. There was a novel that I think is still out of print called The Middle Way or The Middle Years,
Yeah.
which I haven't read for a very long time because I haven't been able to find a copy, about women who are divorced and living on their own with children who have grown up, taking in lodgers and trying to kind of navigate the world of middle age. So she's gone from exciting me as a teenager into thinking I could be this fabulous woman who is so talented and so beautiful and so brave, to being the real chronicler of women's lives across the decades.
Yes, sure. And you used the phrase "the next big thing" there, the title of a wonderful novel by Anita Brookman about that very thing, the next big thing. Yes. So
I think the other thing about her, she came from the north.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not kind of apparent from that, from her speech. She was educated at the Mount School in York, although she was from Sheffield, but she was northern. And that's very important to her writing. My favorite novel of hers, well, semi-favorite, is Jerusalem the Golden, about a young northern working class student who comes down to London and falls in with some very, very glamorous older people who are, I believe, the Mortimers, John and Penelope Mortimer, and falls into their
the
world.
interconnectedness of all things, Lucy Scholes.
I know.
Look at that.
I know. That is a wonderful. I think that's one of my favourites of her early ones, for sure.
So she was an interloper. She was not somebody who grew up in the home counties and fell into this. She fought for it.
John, of Margaret Drabble's, it's just been mentioned, so this is easy. Of Margaret Drabble's 20 novels, which is the only one, the title of which does not begin with either the definite or indefinite article?
Well, Jerusalem the Golden is the obvious one.
It's the right answer, yes, Jerusalem the Golden. All the rest of her novels begin with the or a.
I was going to say, I can't think of, there are very few of them begin with that. I remember, I think her first one is called A Summer Birdcage, isn't it? And that was...
It
is,
right,
yeah. And then The Garrick Year.
Yes, A Natural Curiosity, which I noticed I have on my shelf at home as well, when I was thinking about. I'm really interested, Linda, in how this book, The Millstone, felt like it to you, that it was a kind of glamorous world. The thing that really struck me reading it, and I hadn't read it before, so it was really interesting going back to it, that there is almost a kind of, that Rosamond has this as a narrative voice. It's much more interesting than I was expecting, much more kind of slightly kind of Bartleby the Scrivener kind of, she's weirdly resistant and original in the way that she navigates her way through all of this life. There's a sort of almost a kind of 50s existentialist. She doesn't know why she worries so much. She's continually assailed by feelings of not fitting in. But at the same time, I love the way she kind of hates her friends but loves her friends. When you think about Margaret Drabble, you think about her as being a chronicler of women's experience through the last 40, 50 years. But this seems to be much more interesting in its first-person narrative than I was expecting to be. I really, really responded to it. I found it, and maybe that's one of the reasons we'll come on to when we talk about the film. The film perhaps didn't succeed quite as well because you don't have that remarkable voice in your head.
Well, John, you were just talking about the characters being shy. It's not just sort of diffident and shy. And here's a clip of Margaret Drabble from about 2015, I think this is, talking to the World Book Club on the World Service about the Millstone. And she's just been asked about the character of George. Did George have some kind of a secret that he wasn't letting on to the reader?
I think he was just very shy. I think that in this novel you have a not impossible situation where two very shy people meet one another and would like to get further together but don't manage it. I mean, I think that's not impossible as a situation. I mean, I look back on my life where I know people have been making an overture to me or wanted to be friends, and I just haven't responded. And I think George is just one of those. He feels that he's a bit of a loner. And I never really knew what George was up to. I mean, he remained a mysterious figure to me as a novelist.
He's obviously out clubbing, is the answer.
There weren't clubs like that in those days. I don't think he was clubbing. Do you think he was? It was so nice if he had been, but I really don't think he was.
So that idea, Lucy, this appears to be one of the things I think about the Millstone is so interesting. It appears to be a very decorous, polite novel, right? Because it has a kind of elegance and formalism to it. It's not stylistically experimental. And yet it's talking about issues which in 1965 are illegal. You know, abortion and George, who it is strongly implied is bisexual. How does she get away with that? Is she being terribly daring, or is she protected by a kind of Cambridge bubble?
God, I don't know. I'm not sure. I mean, I think maybe because it's just the way she deals with it, for me at least, it feels so true to life. It's just real life. She's kind of getting on with these things might have been illegal or not done, but that doesn't mean people weren't getting abortions or being gay, right? So it's just part and parcel of life. And I think the thing that I maybe take away from what she was saying there, and a little bit even in that from the documentary we played the clip from earlier, is I'm really fascinated in this idea that she articulates that Rosamond can't be anything that she isn't. I think it's in the book, and it's sort of, and she talks about it herself. Drabble talks about it herself, their own life. She's very interested in people who are sort of constrained by their own fate, and she makes a kind of comment in that documentary, I think, about her characters when somebody asks her, do you think can you do certain things to your characters? And she says, well, no, because they are confined by the way their nature, they're confined by what they do, and I just sort of have to go along with it to a certain extent. And I think that, to me, that's what I see in the novel. This is maybe a very roundabout way of answering that question, but what I see are these characters. George can't be what he isn't, Rosamond can't be who she isn't. So they can't bridge that divide between them. They can't be anything but these quite shy characters with each other who've had this sexual encounter, which, neither of them is even quite sure what that sexual encounter, I mean, Rosamond isn't quite sure what that sexual encounter means. She doesn't necessarily want George to come back and ask her to marry him. There's that wonderful bit at the end where he makes a comment about she didn't really want a husband anyway, she wouldn't do it like that. And I think these characters they're trapped in their own identities in the way that we all are in real life, right?
Yes.
The scenes with George are generally rendered in dialogue, and the dialogue is absolutely brilliant because it's full of sort of subtle silences and nuances and things that are not quite expressed. I was very interested to hear her say she doesn't know what George is up to, because the reader doesn't know either. We know what Rosamond's up to. After they have sex this one time, he says, well, I ought to go. And she says, I wanted to say don't go, but I couldn't. I didn't think, it was a fear of being impolite or not wanted or being rejected. So she can't say anything. And you've no idea whether he is just trying to get out of there after this one incident, or if he would like to stay. You've no idea. And there's a remarkable bit when her parents write to say they're not coming back from Africa, they're going on to India. And there is this very, very strong implication that they know that she has had a baby and they're staying out of the way to give her some space. But it's not stated because they don't say what they mean either. So it's full of people not saying what they mean, which I think is very English and very kind of 50s, 60s as well.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes.
Like,
Yes, I strongly agree with you.
But that's also to do with class, don't you think, as well? Like there's a sense
Yeah.
of, and that's talked about a lot in the book, that she is of a different class to a lot of the other mothers-to-be that she meets.
There's that brilliant passage near the beginning of the novel where in the conversation she has with George, where she talks about her parents and says, they have to punish themselves, you see. They can't just let things get comfortable. All this going to Africa and so on, other people don't do it. Other people just say they ought to do it. But my parents, they really go. It was the same with the way they brought us up. They were quite absurd, the way they stuck to their principles, never asking us where we'd been when we got back at 3 a.m, sending us to state schools, having everything done on the national health, letting us pick up horrible Cockney accents, making the char lady sit down and dine with us, introducing her to visitors, all that kind of nonsense. My God, they made themselves suffer. And yet at the same time, they were so nice, so kind, so gentle. And people aren't nice and kind and gentle. They just aren't. The char lady went off with all the silver cutlery in the end, and she despised them. I could see her despising them, and she knew they wouldn't take any steps. And the awful thing is, they weren't even shocked when she did it. They had seen it coming, they said. And my brother went and married a ghastly girl whose father was a colonel, and now he lives in Dorking and spends all his time having absolutely worthless people to dinner and playing bridge. My sister still tries, but she married a scientist, and they live on the top of a hill in the middle of the country, on a housing estate near an atomic station. And last time I went, she was stopping the kids from playing with the kids next door because they taught them to say silly bugger. It's been a disastrous experiment in education, and that's all one can call it. I just think that sense of, even in the middle of the 60s, she's incredibly clear-sighted about stuff that isn't being resolved. And I think it was Tessa Hadley who said, people don't behave like her parents anymore. But I think a lot of that sort of middle-class confusion about how to deal with people from other backgrounds feels absolutely contemporary.
One of the things about the parents in this novel is they're Fabians. As their daughter complains, they stick to their principles. And yet at the same time, she can afford to live in a flat in Marylebone that they pay for. There's also an incredible scene where she's separated from her baby in an NHS hospital. She screams in order to get the baby back, and no one will let her see the baby until the specialist arrives, who it turns out is a friend of her father's. So this idea that it's a class study which is simultaneously able to accommodate the principle of the thing and the reality of the thing. She's in a privileged position, and her mistrust of the National Health Service at the same time, right? We're used to thinking of the NHS as being this service for the people, of which we refer to as our NHS, of which we're terribly proud, and it's a very live debate at the moment. But you can see, if you go back 60 years, it's perceived as an imposition.
Do you think it is mistrust, though?
I think it's to do with women's experience of the NHS, because women's experience of hospitals is far greater than it takes up more of women's lives. And there's no question that the NHS used to be organised in such a way that it made life very, very difficult, and it treated women as sort of objects, really. It's very shocking. It's really, really shocking when her baby has gone into hospital for a heart operation and she's told she can't see her for at least 2 weeks because it's inconvenient. It's inconvenient for the staff. And, that idea now is grotesque. I mean, nobody will believe it. But that's where Rosamund comes into her own by just screaming. She screams the place down and doesn't stop until they let her see her baby. And that's where Rosamund fires up and becomes more than her nature. But I suppose it is part of her nature. But just the thing about class, rereading it this week, I was really struck by how uncomfortable her descriptions of the women that she is in the hospital with, in the waiting room with, is. And the class sort of snobbery really kind of tells, because she feels herself to be very different. But at the same time, she understands she is now down amongst the women.
It's also reinforced in the film adaptation, A Touch of Love, with the script by Drabble, where she can't go to a waiting room without sitting next to an overweight woman or an
Mm.
immigrant. All
Yeah.
those are all framed as this, and yet knowingly, I think this poor middle class girl is having to slum it to some extent, and yet at the same time, the care that she receives within that system is an education to her, right,
Yeah.
Lucy? She's like, this is a fascinating example of a type of education, a character undergoing an education.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like I maybe read it slightly differently to some of. I mean, I think second time round reading it for this podcast, I was really struck about how much to me this book was about the NHS, which I think I hadn't thought so much first time round. I've been much more focused on Rosalind and her experience, and I was thinking this time round, I kept thinking this is a portrait of the NHS, and it's kind of its good sides, its bad sides, everything. I mean, I think I don't know. I feel like she is. I don't know if it's necessarily the fact that she's using the NHS, but the fact that she has been having she makes a lot of point. Doesn't she mention the fact that she hasn't been ill? She's not someone who's ever ill. And I think that's really interesting because so she's saying that when she has to find a doctor, she needs to find a doctor because now she's pregnant. She doesn't even know where to start looking because she hasn't been ill since she was a child. And I think that is it. I mean, you might disagree with me, but I don't get the sense that she's particularly concerned about using the NHS. I think she's happy it's there and she'll use it. But she feels very at sea in that world because it's not somewhere she's had to be before. And suddenly she is this very, and also, I mean, this is an obvious thing to say, but this is a young girl whose entire life is the life of the mind, right? And now she's pregnant, and for the first time, she has to really get to grips with herself as a body and as a female body in the world that's going to be prodded and poked and by all these male doctors. You know, she's never going to see women.
Well, we have a clip here from the film. It's just a very short clip from The Touch of Love, which if anybody's listened to the previous episode of Backlisted on the Eustace Diamonds by Anthony Trollope, they will hear a continuity here between that episode and this episode. So, Nikki, could we hear that clip, please?
Now then, who are you?
Stacey, Rosamond Stacey.
Whatever are you doing here, then? You're supposed to be in Ward D.
I'm here because I was put here.
You're not supposed to be here. Come on, get up. You're supposed to be in Ward D.
Where is Ward D, then?
Come on, get a move on. There'll be trouble if they catch you in here.
And bloody hell, can you blame me if one of your colleagues was incompetent enough to put me in the wrong room?
No.
All right, just how do I get there?
Oh, how do you think?
No.
Now, admittedly, it's going to be more challenging when we do our episode on Galapagos by Kurt Vonnegut to find a clip with Penelope Keith in it. But but there she was again, as she was in the last episode. There she was again. That was Sandy Dennis and the young Penelope Keith in a scene from A Touch of Love with Penelope Keith playing a nurse in the NHS. So this seems like a very good moment for us to take a break and hear this word from our sponsors.
Fellas, you know Degree Cool Rush deodorant, right? Well, last year they changed the formula, and guys were mad about it. One dude even started a petition. So guess what? Degree heard us, admitted they messed up, and brought the original Cool Rush scent back exactly how it was. And it's in Walmart, Target, and other stores now for under $4. So grab some and remember why its cool, crisp, and fresh scent made it the #1 men's antiperspirant for the last decade. Degree Cool Rush is back, and it smells like victory for all of us.
Linda, this book is also a novel about abortion, an issue which continues to be an important and divisive one. How does it stand up now, do you think, 60 years later on that topic?
It tells you how difficult it was to get an abortion, even if you were middle class. It tells you that a woman as intelligent as Rosamond still believes the old wives' tale about the hot bath and the bottle of gin, which is, ridiculous. Her friend Lydia, the novelist, who comes and lives with her to look after the baby while she's out at the library, explains that she tried to get an abortion and she went to, a Harley Street man. And there was this kind of catch-22. She said, I'm too crazy to have a baby. And he said, well, I think you're too crazy to have an abortion. So it's a sort of, catch-22. everybody expects that she's going to have the baby adopted. And there's this excruciating scene in the hospital after she's given birth. And they're saying, isn't it, don't you think it's a little selfish of you to want to keep this baby when there's, nice couple, childless couple who could give it a better life than you can? I mean, by the time it was published in 1965, the abortion was still completely illegal. The act wasn't passed till 1967, and abortion wasn't legalized until the following year, 1968. But also, it was still very difficult for unmarried women to get contraception. She's not on any form of contraception because she's not expected to have sex. It's a world in which women have no control over their fertility. They just don't. And it's, even with the best will in the world, she can't find a way to to terminate her pregnancy. But although she realizes she wants to have a baby, she never quite explains why. She never spells out why she wants it, but then she just thinks, well, she does. She does. And she's a wonderful mother and has a wonderful baby.
Yeah.
Until this heart problem develops. And then she realizes that her whole life has to be taken up with protecting her child.
Is the novel really about the relationship between the mother and the baby?
I was thinking that. I was thinking when I read it this time around as well, it struck me that it is a love story, but it's about it's a love affair between a mother and a child, and about and about Rosamund, I think, falling in love with her child. There are points at which I didn't actually double check this before the show, but there are bits early on where she talks about the baby as an it, and then by the end she talks entirely, if I'm remembering correctly, my baby, my baby.
Yes. My baby. Yeah.
I mean, and that's what really struck me, I think, this time around, about how much it is a love story between them.
Amazingly moving bit towards the end where she says that when she prays, she not having a clear sense really of God, despite her kind of Fabian socialist background, she prays, and it's very moving, and quotes sort of Ben Jonson about the death of his child. And I think I kind of love that way. She says something wonderful at one point where she says about, I have a vague sense, she said, I had a vague and complicated sense that this pregnancy had been sent to me in order to reveal to me a scheme of things totally different from the scheme in which I inhabited, totally removed from academic enthusiasms, social consciousness, etiolated, undefined emotional connections, and the exercise of free will. It's kind of baby as reality principle, connecting her to her ability, and also connecting to her ability to love.
Yeah. Well, going back to that documentary, One Pair of Eyes, can you imagine this happening now? Here is Margaret Drabble being quizzed on the subject of the Millstone by a group of school children in Sheffield. The mind boggles that this would be broadcast now, but here we go.
What do you think about abortion then? Because in the Millstone, the girl doesn't really want an abortion, does she?
Now, I myself think that the abortion laws were archaic and wicked and so on and so forth, and should have been changed. And indeed, kind of, did what I could to do something about it. But this doesn't mean that I myself, I have a very strong religious feeling about unborn children. I mean, and yet I don't feel that one can impose one's own this is really what I mean, one can't impose one's own mystical sense about how marvellous it is to have a child on the mother of 9 who's about to, risk her life with the tens. I think it's wicked to impose one's own rather hazy mystical notions about the virtues of life on somebody in a position like that.
Therefore, if you'd been in her position, would you have done as she had done?
I would have done what she did. Yes, certainly I would have done. But I mean, I wouldn't in any way condemn anybody who didn't. It's just that I think that she did the right thing. I think that I admire her for feeling as she did about it, for feeling that she had to have the baby because it was hers.
Just for what it's worth, the next child asks if she believes in God, and if not, where her moral framework comes from. It's like, but isn't that fascinating? I think we've heard clips from the beginning of her career and nearer the end of her career. She seems to me someone who is willing to listen and engage totally with her readers. She's fascinating. her view is the book is about one thing, but she's terribly interested in hearing what her readers believe the book to be about.
Yeah, I did a literary festival event with her in Bath a few years ago. I believe the two of you were there.
Yeah, we were.
We had dinner with her afterwards.
We did.
And yeah, I mean, she is in a dialogue with people about her book, she about her work.
For an intellectual writer who is perhaps typecast as a kind of Hampstead intellectual, I find her tremendously generous towards her readers. The pluralist reading of her work is very, very generous from someone perceived as such a kind of high-table author.
On a personal level, I feel very angry that she has been pigeonholed as the novelist of Hampstead adultery,
Quite.
because I've read most of her novels. I can't actually think of any that are set in Hampstead. She doesn't write novels about adultery. I think she's been maligned, very, very badly maligned over the years. And I'm not sure why that's happened. I mean, it happens to other women. Joni Mitchell, for example, was typecast as a folkie, and that kind of really sort of boils my piss. If I'm allowed to say that on Backlisted.
Indeed.
I think she's a remarkable novelist who's had a remarkable career, and I think she's written a run of extraordinary books. I mean, I don't love them all equally. I don't know if anyone's work equally in that sense, but I think she's just so far more than what she has been typecast as being, and I think she always has been.
Well, you're an enthusiast for Margaret Drabble's work. Here is a clip from World Book Club in 2015, where another enthusiast for Margaret's work gets to quiz her.
We've got a caller on the line now, Peter Donnelly, who's calling from York in the north of England. Peter, hi. Am I right that you're an administrator of the Margaret Drabble Appreciation Society on Facebook?
That's correct, yes.
And you have a question for Miss Drabble?
Yes, it was about the Millstone. I heard it dramatised on the radio a few years ago, and I believe it's been televised as well in the past, adapted by yourself. As far as I know, it is the only one that's ever been adapted for television or radio, and it seems to be one that's reread quite a bit and used as a choice for book clubs. And I just wondered what it was about this particular novel which made it perhaps a more popular choice to be reread or revisited when some of the others, which I may prefer, they haven't been used in that way.
Thank you. Yes, I think some of the others are better. But there is something about the simplicity of the Millstone, the universality of the theme, which is easily approached from anywhere, that has made it adaptable. And some of the other novels are more complex. I also recommend it to people who haven't read any of my work because it's short. And you don't want to send them off to read The Needle's Eye, which I think is my best novel, because it's very long. So The Millstone, if you don't like it, you haven't lost much time on it. And there's that to be said for it.
Something very British about a man from an appreciation society popping up to say he doesn't really like the book he's asking her about. That's perfect. That's anyway. Linda, I'm aware we haven't really heard much of Margaret Drabble's prose. If you got a section that you would care to read us.
This is the beginning of the book when she's trying to have her bathtub abortion and her friends turn up. And they're all kind of literary types. And she has a great friend called Lydia, who is a wannabe debut novelist. Lydia was the only one who had read... no, she's not a wannabe debut novelist. She's a novelist.
Yeah.
Lydia is a novelist. Lydia was the only one who had really made it. She had published a couple of novels, but had now for some time been mooching around London moaning that she had nothing else to say. Nobody sympathised with her at all, understandably. She was only 26, so what did she have to worry about? In view of her state, she seized with delight upon any stories of the atrocities of other people's latest books, of which we managed to offer a kindly few. It's no good anyway, said Dick, after dismissing Joe Hurt's latest with a derisive sneer. churning them out like that, one a year. Mechanical, that's what it is. A bit more mechanism wouldn't hurt you, I said gaily. I was on my second large gin. Lydia, who had hitherto been accepting our devious comfort, suddenly turned on us with a wail of despondency. I don't care what you say, she said. It's better to write bad books than no books. It really is. Writing nothing is nothing, just nothing. It's wonderful to turn out one a year. I think Joe Hurt is wonderful. I admire it. I admire that kind of thing. You haven't read it, said Dick. That's not the point, said Lydia. It's the effort that's the point. Why don't you write a bad book then, I asked. I bet you could write a bad book if you wanted to, couldn't you? Not if I knew it was bad when I was writing it. I couldn't do it. I couldn't get it done. What a romantic view of literary creation, said Dick. Speak for yourself, said Lydia crossly. Get yours published and then start calling me romantic. Pass the gin, Rosie, there's a darling.
Oh,
wonderful.
I mean, it's great prose. It really is.
As you say, Linda, so of its time as well, right? The idea that, you know, what you did in the evening, if you were in London, you went to see a Fellini film. New Fellini film.
Talked about books.
On
All the
Regent
stuff that
Street,
Linda
on the
was loving.
Cameo Polly, yeah.
Cameo Polly.
I wouldn't say it wasn't true that writers don't sit around dissing each other's books, which they haven't read.
My favourite comic scene in this novel, other than those early scenes, is the discovery that Lydia has been writing a novel, and it turns out that Lydia's novel is about Rosamond. And Rosamond finds it and reads it with a mounting... At first, she thinks she comes out quite well from it. And then she starts... Lydia obviously is sort of very dismissive about the scholarship that she's doing, which Rosamond is extremely proud of and remains proud of all the way through the book. So she gets cross with it, and then it disappears like a kind of, you know, in MacGuffin-like way into the book. And then it reappears brilliantly when Octavia, who's now a toddler, sneaks into Lydia's bedroom and eats half the novel. She finds it in a kind of masticated mess all over the floor. It's just a very, very, very funny scene, and a kind of brilliant symbolic scene about life's revenge on art.
Well, speaking of life's revenge on art, I've got the review here from the Times newspaper when The Millstone was first published. I have to say, I'd love to get your reaction to this. It's an anonymous reviewer, as was the tradition in that time. And it's also worth saying that many of the other reviews of The Millstone were very, very good. But this perhaps not so much. And I'm sharing this with you because in a sense, I think it's indicative of what Margaret Drabble and writers like Margaret Drabble were up against. So this is reviewed, The Millstone is reviewed alongside other novels, including John Wayne's The Young Visitors and P.H. Newby's One of the Founders. And this is what the Times reviewer says. As a constant which always seems variable, the immorality of the young is a good subject for a novel, and 3 of the 5 novels under review deal with it. Miss Drabble, in her admirably written third novel, The Millstone, has created a self-righteous, unmarried mother called Rosamond. This heroine tells her own story in a disciplined stream of consciousness style of how she conceives from her first and only sexual experience, determines to have the baby, and goes through the machinery of the welfare state to do so. The character of this young feminist is plausible enough. She is the daughter of academic socialist parents whose luxurious Marylebone flat she shamefacedly lives in. Her language has the traces of pedantry, which would be typical of a thesis-writing girl just down from university. Her judgments and descriptions are suffused with the class consciousness of the would-be classless socialist middle class. There are several excellent scenes of middle-class life. However, there is a disappointing lack of thought behind the theme. Miss Drabble's concern is really only for what the neighbours will think, and her moral stand is how fine it is to defy them. She never goes beyond the limits of careful realism. There is no consideration of what life will be like for the fatherless child, no ethical evaluation of Rosamond's purposeful avoidance of marriage, no explanation for the inadequacy of all the male characters. Therefore, though well written, The Millstone is no more than a special kind of woman's novel.
Ooh.
That's so harsh.
Yeah.
I'll tell you what that reminded me of, how contemporary critics of Sally Rooney treat her work. So, Lucy, would it be accurate to describe Margaret Drabble as the Sally Rooney of her day?
I think what's so strange about that, though, is that to me anyway, the idea that Rosamund, to me, is a very moral. She's a character who's incredibly worried about the sort of morality of what she's doing. I guess just her morals are not the same as the reviewer's morals in that sense. And I suppose that's what she's up against throughout the whole book, isn't it? That other people think she's doing this terrible thing in bringing a baby into the world and they won't have a father. And she says, well, that doesn't matter. If I love this baby, the baby's mine, and that's all that counts. I don't know. It's a very dated, and it reminds me so much of that clip you played at the beginning. The way that even Drabble's being talked about, right? That how dare you think that you can have a career alongside having a baby? It's such a, and I love. I don't think we maybe mentioned this specifically, but I love in that first clip from Drabble how unapologetic she is. I love that about it. That she doesn't. She says, "Yes, of course, I'm always going to feel bad," but she doesn't make any apologies. She doesn't try and kind of say, "I should be ashamed for doing this." There's no shame.
She's brilliantly ingenuous in how she answers questions all through her career. Right, you've heard different points, different people, school children, men, and people on Facebook asking her questions, and she just takes them straight on. Yeah. She deals with them straightforwardly. Linda, a special kind of woman's novel.
It's a style of literary criticism or reviewing that we don't really have anymore, which is making moral comments on the content. And he says, I think, I'm assuming it's a man, they say twice, it's very well written, which is what I would have underlined and taken away from that if I had been
excerted
Margaret
on the
Drabble.
paperback jacket.
Yeah. Yes. I think reviews of Great Gatsby were like that.
Yeah.
It's the 60s equivalent of I didn't find the characters likable.
Relatable, but not relatable because I am not a young woman. Yes, absolutely, yeah. Lucy, would you take us out with a reading from The Millstone, please?
Yes, of course. I'm going to read a section from when she's in the hospital for one of her antenatal appointments. Is that?
Yeah.
I'm getting it right? Yeah. Okay. Wondered if I had the right word. So she's in the.
Has the baby been born?
No.
Then
so
antenatal.
It's antenatal,
is
isn't it? Yeah. Showing my lack of understanding of this. So yes, as you might have guessed, I haven't had a baby of my own. No idea. She's in the hospital. She hasn't had the baby. She's having an appointment to check the baby's okay. Okay. They all had one thing in common, of course, though their conditions varied from the invisible to the grossly inflated. As at the doctor's, I was reduced almost to tears by the variety of human misery that presented itself. Perhaps I was in no mood for finding people cheering, attractive, or encouraging, but the truth is they looked to me an unbelievably depressed, miserable lot. One hears much, though mostly from the interested male, about the beauty of a woman with child, ships in full sail, and all that kind of metaphorical euphemism. And I suppose that from time to time on the faces of the well-fed, well-bred young ladies that I had seen a certain peaceful glow, but the weight of evidence is overwhelmingly on the other side. Anemia and exhaustion were written on most of the countenances. The clothes were dreadful, the legs swollen, the bodies heavy and unbalanced. There were a few cases of striking wear. A huge middle-aged woman who could walk only with a stick, a pale, thin creature with varicose veins and a 2-year-old child in tow, and a black woman who sat there not with the peasant acceptance of physical life of which one hears, but with a look of wide-eyed, dilating terror. She was moaning to herself softly and muttering, almost as though she were already in labour. Perhaps, like me, she was more frightened of the hospital than of anything else. Even those who had no evident complaints and who might well have been expected to be full of conventional joy were looking cross and tired, possibly at the prospect of having such a tedious afternoon. There were a couple of young girls in the row in front of me, the kind of girls who chatter and giggle on buses and in cafes, but they were not giggling. They were complaining at great lengths about how their backs ached and how they felt sick and how they felt they'd never get their figures back. It seemed a shame, and there we all were, and it struck me that I felt nothing in common with any of these people, though I disliked the look of them, that I felt a stranger and a foreigner there, and yet I was one of them. I was like that too. I was trapped in a human limit for the first time in my life, and I was going to have to learn how to live inside it.
Fabulous.
That's
Thank you so much.
Brilliant passage. I'm afraid that is where we'll have to leave the not-so-mean streets of 60s London. Huge thanks to Linda and Lucy for leading us through the Drabble lands and to Nikki for making the sounds of our remote quartet feel bedsit close.
If you would like show notes with clips, links, and suggestions for further reading for this show and the 189 that we've already recorded, please visit our website at backlisted.fm. And if you'd like to know what we've been reading this week, you can hear that on Locklisted, which is available via our Patreon, patreon.com/backlisted. If you would like to buy the books discussed, visit our shop at bookshop.org and choose Backlisted as your bookshop. And we're always keen to hear from you on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram.
Yes, your Patreon subscription, mentioning that, picking that up again from Andy, brings you other benefits. Indeed, if you subscribe at the lot listener level for about the same amount as a bottle of gin from Rosamund's local Unwins, you get 2 extra exclusive podcasts every month. We call it Locklisted because it began in the Wenlock Tavern just before lockdown, and it features the 3 of us talking and recommending the books we've been reading and films and music we've enjoyed in the previous fortnight. People who have subscribed at this level also get their names read out on the podcast, accompanied by lashings of genuine thanks and gratitude. So here we go. Thank you to Andy Sharman, marvellous writer. Thank you, Andy. Thank you to Cohen Cuggle. Thank you to Deborah de Biase. Thank you to Jeff Johnson. And thank you to Rui Silva.
Thank you, Gretchen Moline. Thank you, Stefan Scarup. Thank you, Helene Hewitt. Thank you, P. Cabredo Hofher. Thank you, Phoebe. Thanks, all of you. Thank you so much. Now, before we go, Lucy, is there anything you wish to add on the topic of Margaret Drabble and or the Millstone that we have not covered?
Where do I begin? No, only joking. I think the only thing the only thing I would say that we didn't have the chance to discuss is just how interesting a career she had when she starts out writing these early novels, are very interested in sort of individual female experience. And then as she goes and becomes clearly kind of more established and I think aware of her own voice, she branches out. And by the sort of late 70s and into the 80s, she's writing these kind of very, very kind of big condition of England novels, which are hugely important. And I think that's something that, you know, people like to maybe dismiss her earlier work as sort of that, whatever the quote was from the review about a particular kind of woman's story, but she's really not doing that throughout her career. And I think that in itself is a fascinating transition as well.
Yes, I feel like there's a whole oeuvre to explore with Margaret Drabble. And Linda, as you were saying, you know, she's sort of been rather typecast over the last however many years, but in fact, the range of her work is pretty incredible.
I think it's also interesting that all her novels, as far as I can remember, are all contemporary. They're all set in the present. She doesn't write historical novels. She doesn't run out of things to say. She always has something to say. And unlike Lucy, I really liked her final novel because, she's 10 years ahead of me in terms of aging. And she deals with death, and it's extraordinary. I think it's an extraordinary book. I can understand why somebody of your age wouldn't relate to it, perhaps. But I really did.
I'm ordering it now.
Well, listen, thanks so much, both of you. Thank you. This is I'd read The Millstone before, but going back to it, what I found so interesting is, as you were both saying, this seemingly quite slim novel manages to contain so many readings within it. I had a very different experience on second reading than I had on the first reading, and I also, we haven't talked about it much, but I thoroughly enjoyed the film adaptation, A Touch of Love. If you want a bit of late 60s post Kathy Come Home kitchen sink, it fulfills that brief tremendously eloquently. Also has some lovely shots of the old reading room at the British Library too. Johnny?
I really, really loved this book in a way that I wasn't quite expecting to. I just wanted just one sentence that sums up to me its sort of strange kind of intelligence. That review couldn't have been wrong. I think there's a really, really interesting moral intelligence at work in this book. But she says very early on, Rosamund, the character, says, "I did not realize the dreadful facts of life. I did not know that a pattern forms before we are aware of it, and that what we think we make becomes a rigid prison making us." It's good. That's, one for the notebook. Amazing book.
Well, thanks for giving us the feel-good ending we needed at the end.
I could do one
Johnny,
that's funny.
thanks, man.
I could do one that's funny.
No, go on, give us another one. Go on.
This I thought, this is for Backlisted fans. They'll love this. She says, I do not care very much for plots myself, but I do like to have a sequence of events.
Oh, no. I'm not. I don't approve of that. No. Well, listen, thanks, Linda. Thanks, Lucy. And thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
We'll see you next time.
Back in a
Thank you.
fortnight. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.